Sometimes the cruelest wounds come from the people who are supposed to love you most. Nothing hurts quite like watching your own granddaughter's face fall when her own tribe laughs at the only home you can give her. Old Nokose and 8-year-old Ahyoka inherit a falling-down wooden hut that everyone calls worthless. The tribe mocks them for living in what looks like ruins. But this broken place holds secrets that nobody knows about. When little Ahyoka finds a loose board under the floor, she discovers something that will change everything. The same people who laughed at them will soon see why this old hut was never worthless at all. What was hidden under those floorboards that made the entire tribe stop laughing? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Apache settlement, painting the red earth in shades of amber and gold. Nokose sat on a weathered wooden stump outside the crumbling hut, his calloused hands wrapped around a cup of bitter coffee that had grown cold an hour ago. At 70 winters, his face bore the deep lines of a man who had seen too much, the kind of furrows that came not just from age, but from carrying sorrows that never seemed to lighten their load. Beside him, Ahyoka knelt in the dust, carefully arranging small stones in patterns only she understood. Her dark hair caught the early light, and when she smiled, which she did often, despite everything, her whole face seemed to glow with the kind of innocent joy that made Nokose's chest tighten with fierce protectiveness. She was all he had left of his daughter, Ayana, and sometimes the resemblance was so strong it took his breath away. "Grandfather," Ahyoka said without looking up from her stone patterns. "Why do the other children say our house is cursed?" The question hit him like a physical blow, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. He had been dreading this conversation, knowing it would come eventually. Children had a way of absorbing the cruelest truths, no matter how hard adults tried to shield them. "What do you think, little one?" he asked instead, a technique his own grandfather had used, answering questions with questions that made children think deeper. Ahyoka paused in her stone arranging, her small fingers hovering over a particularly smooth river rock. "I think they're afraid of something they don't understand. When Mother was born here and when she stopped, her voice catching slightly. "When she went to the spirit world here, maybe they think the sadness is still trapped inside the walls." Nokose felt his throat constrict. Sometimes his granddaughter's wisdom startled him, as if she carried an old soul in her young body. "And what do you feel when you're inside our home?" "Safe," she said immediately, looking up at him with those dark eyes that were so much like Ayana's. "I feel Mother's love still living in the wood and the stones, like she's still protecting us." The old man set down his coffee cup and reached over to stroke her hair, marveling at how this child could find warmth in a place that others saw only as a monument to tragedy. The hut behind them was indeed falling apart. The roof leaked in 3 places, the door hung crooked on rusted hinges, and the whole structure seemed to sag under the weight of neglect and time. But it was theirs, the only thing Ayana had been able to leave them, and Nokose would defend their right to it until his last breath. The settlement stirred to life around them. Women emerged from their homes to begin the day's cooking, sending the rich scents of cornmeal and roasted chilies drifting on the morning air. Men gathered near the central fire pit, their voices low and serious as they discussed the day's hunting and the persistent drought that had been plaguing their land for months. Children ran between the dwellings, their laughter bright and careless, though Nokose noticed how they gave his granddaughter a wide berth. "There goes crazy old Nokose and his cursed child," he heard one of the women mutter to her companion as they passed by. The words were spoken in Apache, meant to be understood, meant to cut. Still living in that death house like spirits themselves. Ahyoka's shoulders stiffened slightly, but she continued arranging her stones with determined concentration. Nokose felt anger rise in his chest like smoke from a fire, but he had learned long ago that responding to such comments only made them worse. Better to let his granddaughter see how to bear dignity in the face of cruelty. Chief Nalnish approached from the direction of the tribal council lodge, his heavy frame moving with the slow deliberation of a man who carried the weight of many decisions. Once he and Nokose had been close friends, hunting partners who could read each other's thoughts across a valley full of deer. But that was before Ayana's death, before the whispers started, before the tribe began to see Nokose as a man touched by too much sorrow to be trusted with important matters. "Nokose," the chief said with a formal nod, "the council meets today to discuss the water situation. Your knowledge of the old places might be valuable. It was an olive branch of sorts, though wrapped in the careful language of politics." Nokose recognized the gesture for what it was, pity disguised as respect. "I appreciate the invitation, old friend, but my place is here with Ahyoka." Chief Nalnish's eyes flicked to the child, and his expression softened slightly. "She grows more like her mother every day." "Yes," Nokose replied simply. "She does." After the chief walked away, Ahyoka looked up from her stones. "You could have gone to the council meeting." "I could have," he agreed. "But I would rather be here, watching you make magic with rocks and learning what new questions you have for me today." She giggled, the sound like water over smooth stones. "It's not magic, grandfather. It's just patterns. Mother taught me about patterns before she went away." Nokose's breath caught. Ahyoka rarely spoke about her memories of Ayana, who had died when the child was only 5. The few times she did, it was usually something simple, the way her mother hummed while cooking, or how she braided flowers into Ahyoka's hair. But this was different. This suggested something more specific. "What kind of patterns?" he asked carefully. "Patterns that tell stories," Ahyoka said, moving a stone to create a small spiral. "Mother said that everything in nature follows patterns, and if you know how to read them, they can tell you things. Like how the clouds pattern tells you about rain, or how the way birds fly can tell you about wind." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "She said our people used to read the patterns in everything, in the stars, in the way water flowed, in the way animals moved. But that too many of the pattern readers had gone to the spirit world, and the knowledge was being forgotten." Nokose felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. He had never heard Ayana speak of such things. Yet something about what Ahyoka described resonated with half-remembered stories from his own childhood. Tales his grandmother had whispered about the old ways when the spirit still spoke directly to the people. "Show me," he said quietly. Ahyoka's face lit up with pleasure at his serious attention. She began rearranging the stones with more purpose now, creating interlocking circles and spirals that seemed to flow into each other like water, finding its natural course. As she worked, she spoke in a voice that seemed older than her years. "This pattern is for water," she said, indicating a curved line of white stones. "And this one is for hidden things," she added, pointing to a spiral made of darker rocks. "When you put them together like this," she moved several stones to create a connection between the two patterns. "It means water that is hidden, but can be found if you know where to look." Nokose stared at the arrangement, feeling something stir in his memory like wind disturbing long-settled dust. There was something familiar about what she had created, something that tickled the edges of his consciousness without quite revealing itself. "Did your mother teach you about any other patterns?" he asked. "Many," Ahyoka said proudly. "But she made me promise to only share them with family, with people who would protect the knowledge, instead of using it for the wrong reasons." Before Nokose could respond, a shadow fell across them. He looked up to see Bidzil, one of the younger tribal members, standing with his arms crossed and a sneer on his face. "Still playing with rocks, little ghost girl?" Bidzil said mockingly. "Maybe if you spent more time learning useful skills instead of making up stories about magic rocks, people might actually want to be around you." Ahyoka's hands stilled on her stones, but she didn't look up. Nokose started to rise, ready to defend his granddaughter, but she spoke first. "These aren't magic rocks," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the cruel words. "They're just stones that help me remember the stories Mother told me. But you wouldn't understand because you don't know how to listen to the old stories." Bidzil laughed harshly. Old stories won't put food in your belly or water in your cup, child. Maybe it's time you learned to live in the real world instead of whatever fantasy that old man fills your head with. This time, Nokose did stand, his full height still impressive despite his years.
That's enough, Bidzil.
The child has done nothing to earn your cruelty. Nothing except exist as a reminder of cursed bloodlines and bad decisions, Bidzil shot back. Look around you, old man. We're struggling to survive, and you're indulging a child's fantasies instead of contributing to the tribe's welfare. And what exactly are you contributing besides bitter words and empty judgment? Nokose asked, his voice dangerously quiet. For a moment the two men stared at each other, the tension thick enough to cut. Then Bidzil spat in the dust near Nokose's feet and stalked away, muttering under his breath about wasted resources and foolish old men. Ahyoka had gone very still during the confrontation, her small hands clenched into fists. When Nokose sat back down beside her, he saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Grandfather," she whispered, "why do they hate us so much?" Nokose pulled her close, feeling her small body trembling with suppressed emotion. "They don't hate us, little one. They're afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of things they don't understand. Afraid of memories that make them sad. Afraid of being reminded that life can be cruel and unfair." He stroked her hair gently. "But mostly, they're afraid of their own pain, so they try to give it to someone else to carry." Ahyoka leaned against his shoulder, and he could feel some of the tension leaving her body. After a long moment, she spoke again. "Mother used to say that the strongest trees are the ones that grow in the hardest ground." "She was right," Nokose said, marveling again at his daughter's wisdom, living on in this remarkable child. "And you, my dear granddaughter, are growing into the strongest tree I have ever seen." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the settlement wake up around them. Despite the morning's harsh words, Nokose felt a deep sense of peace in this simple moment, sharing the sunrise with the most precious person in his world, surrounded by the remnants of a life that others might see as broken, but that he knew was filled with more love than many people ever experienced. Inside the crumbling hut behind them, a loose floorboard shifted slightly in the morning warmth, settling deeper into its frame with a soft creak that neither of them noticed. Beneath that board, wrapped carefully in oiled leather and hidden for nearly 3 years, lay a collection of items that would soon transform their lives in ways neither could imagine. But for now, there was just an old man and a young girl sitting in the morning sun, surrounded by stones arranged in patterns that told stories only they understood, carrying forward the love of a woman who had died too young, but whose wisdom lived on in whispered teachings and inherited dreams. The day stretched ahead of them, full of ordinary moments and small kindnesses, completely unaware that within hours everything would change forever. The trouble started 3 hours after noon, when the sun hung merciless and white in a cloudless sky, baking the settlement until even the lizards sought shade under the scattered rocks. Nokose was inside the hut, trying to patch one of the roof leaks with strips of bark and tree sap, when he heard the voices outside growing louder and more aggressive. "Nothing but a drain on tribal resources," came Bidzil's voice, pitched to carry. "Look at them, living in that ruin like animals. It's an embarrassment to our people." Nokose climbed down from the rickety stool he'd been standing on and moved to the doorway, staying just inside the shadows where he could observe without being easily seen. A small crowd had gathered near their home, drawn by Bidzil's inflammatory words like moths to a flame. "The child deserves better than this," said Kwahu, an elder woman whose opinion carried significant weight in the tribe. Her tone was not cruel like Bidzil's, but it carried the certainty of someone accustomed to being heard. "Living in the place where her mother died, it's not natural. It's not healthy. Where else would they go?" asked Siala, one of the few tribal members who had ever shown them kindness. "This is their home." "Home?" Bidzil laughed bitterly. "Look at it. Half the roof is gone, the walls are rotting, and it reeks of death and failure. Chief Nalnish should order them to tear it down and move them to proper housing. Nokose felt his jaw clench. Proper housing meant the communal lodge where elderly tribal members without family lived, a place of charity and pity, where Ahyoka would be surrounded by whispers about her cursed bloodline and her grandfather's fall from grace. "And what gives you the authority to make such decisions?" Ciala asked sharply. "Common sense," Bidzil replied, "and concern for the child's welfare. She's being raised like a wild thing, playing with rocks and talking to spirits. The old man is filling her head with nonsense instead of preparing her for real life." That was when Ahyoka's voice cut through the argument, clear and defiant. "This is our home, and you have no right to talk about tearing it down." Nokose's heart lurched as he saw his granddaughter standing in the middle of the gathered adults. Her small fists clenched at her sides, her dark eyes blazing with anger and hurt. She had been playing by the stream and must have returned to find them discussing her fate as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. "Ahyoka," Ciala said gently, "no one is trying to hurt you." "Yes, they are," the child interrupted, her voice shaking but determined. "They want to take away the only place where I can still feel my mother's love. They want to pretend she never existed, just like they pretend grandfather never used to be important to this tribe." Bidzil's face flushed with anger. "You see, this is exactly what I mean. The child has no respect, no understanding of her place. She needs proper guidance, not the indulgent fantasies of a broken old man." "Broken?" Ahyoka's voice rose to a shout. "He's not broken! He's the wisest person I know, and he loves me more than any of you ever could. At least he doesn't say cruel things just to hear himself talk." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Nokose saw several of the gathered adults shift uncomfortably. Even Bidzil seemed taken aback by the child's fierce defense. "Enough," Kwahu said firmly. This discussion should not be happening in front of the child, but Ahyoka wasn't finished. Tears streamed down her face now, but her voice remained strong. "You think our house is worthless because it's old and needs fixing. You think we're worthless because we're sad sometimes, and we remember people who are gone. But you're wrong. You're all wrong, and someday you'll see." With that, she turned and ran toward the hut, pushing past Nokose and disappearing into the dim interior. He heard her sob once, before the sound was muffled, probably by the pile of blankets that served as her bed. Nokose stepped fully into the doorway, drawing himself up to his full height. The gathered adults fell silent, suddenly uncomfortable under his steady gaze. "You have said your piece," he told them, his voice carrying the authority he had once wielded as one of the tribe's most respected elders. "Now I ask you to leave my granddaughter in peace. She has suffered enough judgment for one day." Bidzil opened his mouth to say something else, but Kwahu silenced him with a sharp look. The crowd began to disperse, some looking ashamed, others merely uncomfortable with the emotional scene they had witnessed. When they were alone, Nokose found Ahyoka curled up in the corner where her mother's cradle board hung from a wooden peg, a traditional Apache baby carrier decorated with intricate beadwork and soft deerskin. The child was holding one of the leather straps, pressing her face against it as if trying to absorb some lingering essence of maternal comfort. "I'm sorry you had to hear those things," Nokose said softly, settling down beside her. "Are we really worthless, grandfather?" she asked, her voice muffled by tears and leather. "Never," he said firmly. "Not ever. We are exactly as valuable as we choose to be, regardless of what others think or say." Ahyoka sat up and looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Then why do we let them make us feel small?" It was a profound question, one that cut to the heart of his own struggles with grief and loss of status within the tribe. "Because sometimes, little one, it's easier to feel small than to fight for our right to feel big. But maybe it's time we stop taking the easy path." She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "What do you mean?" Nokose looked around the interior of the hut, at the sagging roof beams, the gaps in the wall chinking, the general air of neglect that he had allowed to accumulate over the past 3 years. He had been so lost in his own sorrow, so focused on simply surviving each day, that he had forgotten what it meant to truly live. I mean, maybe it's time we showed them that this place, our home, is worth more than they think. Maybe it's time we fixed it up properly, made it beautiful again, made it worthy of your mother's memory. Ahyoka's face brightened slightly.
You want to fix the house?
I want to rebuild it, Nokose said, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. Not just patch the holes and hope it holds together, but really repair it. Make it strong and beautiful again. Can we do that? Just the two of us? Nokose smiled, feeling something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just the simple pleasure of having a purpose beyond mere survival. We can try. And if anyone wants to criticize us for living in a ruin, well, they'll have to find something else to complain about. Ahyoka threw her arms around his neck, hugging him with the fierce intensity that only children could manage. I love you, grandfather. I love you too, little warrior, he said, holding her close and marveling at how quickly despair could transform into determination when you had someone worth fighting for. They spent the rest of the afternoon assessing what needed to be done, making lists of materials and discussing how to approach each repair. It was while they were examining the floorboards near the back wall, looking for signs of rot that might need to be replaced, that Ahyoka made her discovery. Grandfather, this board feels different, she said, pressing down on a plank that seemed to give more than the others around it. Nokose knelt beside her and tested the board himself. It was definitely loose, but in a way that seemed intentional rather than accidental, as if it had been designed to be removable. Help me lift it, he said, working his fingers under one edge. The board came up easily, revealing a space beneath that was clearly man-made. And there, wrapped in what looked like oiled deerskin and tied with sinew cord, was a bundle that neither of them had ever seen before. Ahyoka gasped, her eyes wide with wonder and excitement. What is it? Nokose stared at the bundle, his heart hammering in his chest. The deerskin looked familiar, similar to pieces his daughter had used for various projects. And unless he was mistaken, that was Ayana's distinctive way of tying cord. A particular knot pattern she had learned from her grandmother. I think, he said slowly, your mother left us something to find. Nokose's hands trembled as he lifted the bundle from its hiding place beneath the floorboard. The oiled deerskin was supple and well-preserved, indicating that Ayana had taken great care in protecting whatever lay within. The familiar scent of sage and sweetgrass rose from the leather, the same mixture his daughter had always used to keep her most precious belongings safe from moisture and insects. Should we open it? Ahyoka whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow disturb the sacred nature of their discovery. Yes, Nokose said after a moment's hesitation. If your mother hid this here, she meant for us to find it. His fingers worked carefully at the sinew cords, recognizing the specific knot pattern that Ayana had learned from his own mother. It was a technique passed down through generations of Apache women, designed to secure precious items while still allowing them to be opened by someone who understood the method. As the leather wrapping fell away, both grandfather and granddaughter gasped at what was revealed. The bundle contained several items, each wrapped individually in soft cloth. The first thing Nokose lifted out was a small leather pouch, no bigger than his fist, decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns he recognized as traditional healing symbols. It's a medicine pouch, he breathed, holding it gently. The leather was darkened with age and use, and when he held it to his nose, the familiar scent of traditional healing herbs filled his nostrils. White sage, cedar, sweetgrass, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Ahyoka leaned closer. It smells like the one grandmother used to carry. The one you told me about. Nokose nodded, his throat tight with emotion. This pouch was nearly identical to the one his mother had used in her healing practice, the one that had been buried with her according to tradition. That Ayana had possessed such a pouch and had hidden it rather than mentioning it to him suggested depths to his daughter's knowledge that he had never suspected. There's more, Ahyoka said, pointing to the other wrapped items still in the bundle. The next item was a collection of what appeared to be hand-drawn maps on pieces of hide, each one covered with symbols and markings that looked both familiar and mysterious. The lines seemed to represent geographic features, rivers, mountains, valleys, but the symbols scattered throughout were unlike anything Nokose had seen in conventional mapping. "These markings," he murmured, studying the intricate drawings. "They're not like any maps I know, but they look like the patterns Mother taught me," Ahyoka said excitedly. "See the symbol here?" That's the one she said meant water that flows underground, and this one means place of spiritual power. Nokose looked at his granddaughter with new understanding. The pattern games he had watched her play, the stone arrangements he had dismissed as childhood fancy, they weren't random creations at all. They were part of a complex system of knowledge that Ayana had been teaching her daughter, a system that connected to these mysterious maps. "What else is in there?" Ahyoka asked, her voice bright with curiosity. The third wrapped item was a collection of what looked like written notes, covered in Ayana's careful handwriting. The papers were filled with observations about plant locations, weather patterns, animal behaviors, and most intriguingly, detailed descriptions of places that seemed to correspond to the maps. As Nokose read, his amazement grew. His daughter had not simply been collecting random information. She had been systematically documenting traditional knowledge, recording the locations of medicinal plants, sacred sites, and natural resources that their people had used for generations. "Listen to this," he said, reading aloud from one of the papers. "The old spring that grandmother spoke of, the one lost when the soldiers came and forced our people to move, I believe I have found evidence of its location. The water signs are still there for those who know how to read them. If the drought continues, this knowledge could save our people." Ahyoka's eyes widened. Mother was looking for the lost spring? Nokose felt a chill run down his spine. The lost sacred spring was part of tribal legend, a source of pure water that their ancestors had revered for its healing properties. According to the stories his grandmother had told him, the spring had been lost when their people were forced to relocate years ago, its location forgotten in the chaos of displacement and trauma. "It seems she was," he said softly. "And from what she wrote here, she may have found it." The fourth and final item in the bundle was perhaps the most mysterious, a collection of small objects that seemed to serve as markers or tokens. There were carved pieces of turquoise, polished stones of various colors, and what appeared to be specially prepared pieces of wood, each one marked with symbols that matched those on the maps. "These look like the pieces Mother used when she played the pattern game with me," Ahyoka said, picking up a piece of turquoise carved in the shape of a water drop. "She said they were memory helpers, that each one stood for a different kind of knowledge." As Nokose examined the tokens more closely, he began to understand their purpose. They weren't just markers, they were a physical representation of the symbolic language used on the maps. Someone who understood the system could use the tokens to decode the maps, translating the abstract symbols into concrete information about locations and resources. "Your mother created an entire system," he said with growing awe, "a way to preserve and pass down traditional knowledge that our people thought was lost forever." But even as wonder filled him, practical concerns began to intrude. Why had Ayana hidden this knowledge instead of sharing it with the tribe? Why had she never mentioned her research to him, her own father? And most troubling of all, why had she felt the need to conceal such valuable information? "Grandfather," Ahyoka said quietly, "why do you think Mother didn't tell anyone about this?" It was the question he had been dreading. "I don't know, little one, but I think she must have had good reasons." They spent the next hour carefully examining each item, with Ahyoka sharing what she remembered of her mother's teachings about the symbols and patterns. The more they discovered, the more complex the system revealed itself to be. This wasn't the work of a casual hobbyist. It represented years of careful research and documentation. As the afternoon light began to fade, Nokose carefully rewrapped the items and placed them back in their hiding spot. Whatever his daughter had discovered, whatever secrets she had uncovered, they needed time to understand the full scope of her work before deciding what to do with the information. "Will we tell the others?" Ahyoka asked as her grandfather replaced the loose floorboard. Nokose considered the question carefully. The practical side of him knew that if Ayana had indeed located the lost sacred spring, such information could be invaluable to the tribe, especially with the current drought threatening their water supplies. But his instinct for caution, honed by years of navigating tribal politics, warned him to proceed slowly. "Not yet," he said finally. "Let's make sure we understand what your mother found before we share it with anyone else. Some knowledge is too precious to reveal carelessly." Outside their hut, the settlement was settling into its evening routines, completely unaware that the two people they dismissed as broken and worthless had just discovered something that might change everything. For now, the secret would remain with them, a grandfather and granddaughter bound together not just by blood and love, but by the shared guardianship of knowledge that their beloved Ayana had entrusted to their care. 3 days after their discovery, Ahyoka was helping Nokose patch a section of the hut's western wall when she made another find that would deepen the mystery even further. Tucked behind a loose piece of chinking, wrapped in the same soft cloth as the other items, was something that made her gasp with recognition and delight. "Grandfather, look!" She held up a beaded necklace, its intricate pattern catching the morning light. "This was Mother's. I remember her wearing it when I was very small." Nokose set down his tools and took the necklace from her with trembling hands. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Ayana wearing this very piece during her naming ceremony, the beads catching firelight as she danced with the other young women of the tribe. He had not seen it since her death and had assumed it had been buried with her, according to tradition. "She must have hidden it here before she became sick," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But why?" The necklace was beautiful work, featuring traditional Apache patterns in turquoise, coral, and white shell beads. But as Nokose examined it more closely, he began to notice something unusual about the bead arrangement. While it appeared to follow traditional decorative patterns at first glance, there were subtle variations, extra beads here, a different color sequence there that seemed almost intentional. "Ahyoka," he said slowly, "do you remember your mother ever talking about this necklace? About what the patterns meant?" The child leaned closer, studying the beadwork with the same intensity she brought to her stone arrangements. After a moment, her face brightened with recognition. "The colors," she said excitedly. "Mother taught me that different bead colors could represent different things in the old system. Blue for water, white for sacred places, red for danger or warning." Nokose felt his pulse quicken. "Show me." Ahyoka traced her finger along the necklace, pointing out sequences of beads as she spoke. "Here, see? Blue bead, then white, then 3 red ones, then blue again. Mother said that pattern meant water at sacred place, but beware the path. And this section here." Nokose indicated a different part of the necklace. "White, blue, white, blue, white. That's the pattern for sacred water source," Ahyoka said confidently. "And these little turquoise chips between the main beads? Mother said those marked distances, like counting steps on a long journey." As they continued to examine the necklace, it became clear that it was far more than a simple piece of jewelry. Like the maps and tokens they had found earlier, it was part of Ayana's system for preserving and transmitting traditional knowledge. The bead patterns corresponded to the symbols on the maps, creating a portable reference that could be worn without arousing suspicion. "Your mother was very clever," Nokose said with growing admiration. "She hid important information in plain sight, disguised as decoration. Can I wear it?" Ahyoka asked, her eyes shining with hope. "I promise to take good care of it." Nokose hesitated. The practical part of him worried about attracting attention to something so valuable, both financially and culturally. But looking at his granddaughter's eager face, seeing how the necklace seemed to strengthen her connection to her mother's memory, he found himself nodding. "Yes, little one, I think your mother would want you to wear it. As he fastened the necklace around Ahyoka's neck, adjusting the length so it hung properly, Nokose felt a deep sense of rightness. The beadwork looked beautiful against her dark skin, and more importantly, he could see how wearing it made her stand a little straighter, smile a little brighter. Their peaceful morning was interrupted by the approach of Tyanita, one of the tribal elders, who occasionally showed them kindness. She was carrying a basket of dried corn and beans, probably another offering meant to help them through the ongoing food shortages that had accompanied the drought. "Good morning, Nokose," she said warmly, then turned to Ahyoka with a grandmother's smile. "And how are you today, little flower?" "I'm well, thank you," Ahyoka replied politely, unconsciously touching the necklace. Tyanita's eyes immediately fixed on the beadwork, and her expression shifted to one of surprise and something that might have been recognition. "What a beautiful necklace. May I see it more closely?" Ahyoka looked to her grandfather for permission, and at his nod, she stepped closer to the older woman. Tyanita studied the beadwork with the practiced eye of someone who had been crafting such pieces for decades. "This is exquisite work," she said slowly. "The pattern is unusual, very old style. I haven't seen beadwork like this since I was a young girl." She looked up at Nokose with curiosity. "Where did you find such a piece?" Nokose felt a moment of panic. He hadn't prepared for this situation, hadn't thought about how to explain the necklace's sudden appearance. "It belonged to Ayana," he said carefully. "I found it among her things and thought Ahyoka should have it." It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. Tyanita nodded slowly, though something in her expression suggested she sensed there was more to the story. "Ayana always had gifted hands for beadwork," the older woman said. "But this pattern, it's not like her usual style. It reminds me of something my own grandmother used to make, back when I was very young." "What do you mean?" Ahyoka asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Tyanita glanced at Nokose, as if asking permission to continue. When he gave a small nod, she knelt down to Ahyoka's eye level. "Long ago, before your grandfather's time even, some of our people used to encode information in their beadwork. Important knowledge about medicine plants, water sources, sacred places. They would weave it into necklaces and belts and other items that could be carried safely." Nokose felt his blood turn cold. If Tyanita could recognize the necklace as an information storage device, how many others might also understand its significance? "Why did they do that?" Ahyoka asked innocently. "Because knowledge is power," Tyanita said softly. "And power can be dangerous if it falls into the wrong hands. So our ancestors learned to hide their most important secrets in ways that looked ordinary to outsiders, but could be read by those who knew the old ways." She stood up slowly, her joints creaking with age. "It's beautiful work, child. Wear it with pride, but also with respect for what it might represent." After Tyanita left, Nokose and Ahyoka worked in thoughtful silence for a while. Finally, Ahyoka spoke up. "Grandfather, do you think there are others who would understand Mother's maps and tokens the way Tyanita understood the necklace?" It was a sobering question. Nokose had been so focused on the wonder of their discovery that he hadn't fully considered the implications of their secret knowledge being recognized by others. If people began to suspect that Ayana had been preserving traditional knowledge, especially knowledge, as valuable as the location of the sacred spring, it could create complications they weren't prepared to handle. "I think we need to be very careful about who we trust with this information," he said. Finally, "But what if Mother found something that could help our people? What if the spring she wrote about could solve the water shortage?" Nokose looked at his granddaughter, marveling at how quickly she grasped the larger implications of their discovery. "That's exactly why we need to be careful, little one. Knowledge that powerful can change lives, but it can also change the people who possess it." As if summoned by their conversation about trust and secrecy, they heard footsteps approaching. This time it was Bidzil, accompanied by 2 other young men from the tribe. Their expressions were not friendly. "Still playing house in your ruin, I see," Bidzil said mockingly. "Though I notice you've been making some improvements." Nokose straightened, instinctively moving closer to Ahyoka. "We're repairing our home." "Is that a problem?" "Not a problem exactly," said one of Bidzil's companions, a man named Ashki. "But people are curious about where you're getting the materials. And the time. Don't you think your efforts would be better spent contributing to the tribe's welfare instead of fixing up a death house?" "This is our home," Ahyoka said firmly, stepping out from behind her grandfather. "We have every right to take care of it." Bidzil's eyes fixed on her necklace, and his expression shifted to one of interest. "Well, well, look at the little princess, all dressed up in fancy jewelry. That's quite a necklace, child. Where did an old man and a charity case get something so expensive?" Nokose felt anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "The necklace belonged to my daughter. Ahyoka is wearing her mother's jewelry, as is her right." "Funny," Bidzil said, circling them slowly like a predator. "I don't remember Ayana wearing anything like that. And I notice you've been acting strangely lately, secretive. What exactly are you two hiding in that shack of yours?" "Nothing that concerns you," Nokose replied firmly. "Everything that happens in this settlement concerns all of us," Ashki interjected, "especially when it involves people who aren't contributing their fair share to the common welfare." Ahyoka's hand moved protectively to her necklace. "We're not hiding anything wrong. We're just trying to make our home nice again." "Then you won't mind if we take a look inside," Bidzil said, starting toward the hut entrance. "Yes, I would mind," Nokose said, moving to block his path. "This is our home, and you have no right to enter without invitation." For a moment the two men faced off, the tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. Finally Bidzil stepped back, but his expression promised that this confrontation was far from over. "We'll be watching," he said coldly. "And if we find out you're hoarding resources or hiding something that rightfully belongs to the tribe, there will be consequences." After they left, Ahyoka looked up at her grandfather with worried eyes. "They suspect something, don't they?" Nokose nodded grimly. "Yes, which means we need to be even more careful about when and how we continue studying your mother's work." But even as he spoke the words of caution, Nokose felt a growing urgency. The drought was worsening daily, and if Ayana had indeed found the sacred spring, that information could be the difference between survival and disaster for their people. The question was no longer whether to reveal what they had discovered, but how to do so without putting themselves and the knowledge itself at risk. The discovery came 2 weeks later, hidden in a place so obvious that they had overlooked it completely. Ahyoka was cleaning out a corner of the hut where water damage had loosened some of the wall chinking when her fingers encountered something hard and smooth embedded in the mud and clay mixture. "Grandfather, there's something in the wall," she called, working her small fingers around the edges of the object. Nokose hurried over and helped her extract what proved to be a fragment of pottery, roughly the size of his palm. The piece was clearly ancient, made from the distinctive red clay that their ancestors had favored, and decorated with symbols that seemed to dance across its curved surface in patterns both beautiful and meaningful. "This is old," he breathed, turning the fragment over in his hands. Very old. The pottery piece bore the unmistakable style of pre-reservation Apache craftsmanship, from the time when their people had lived freely across the vast territories of the Southwest. But more importantly, the symbols carved into its surface matched those they had seen on Ayana's maps and the patterns encoded in the beaded necklace. "Look at this mark here," Ahyoka said, pointing to a symbol that resembled flowing water surrounded by a circle. "That's the same one Mother used for sacred spring in her maps." Nokose studied the pottery more carefully, his excitement growing. If this fragment was authentic, and everything about it suggested that it was, then it represented physical proof that the sacred spring legends were based on historical fact. Their ancestors had not only known of the spring's location, but had considered it important enough to commemorate in their most precious artifacts. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked. Ahyoka led him back to the corner where she had been working. "Right here in the wall." It was like it had been built into the structure itself. As they examined the wall more closely, Nokose realized that what they had assumed was simple mud chinking was actually far more complex. The clay mixture contained fragments of pottery, pieces of carved stone, and other artifacts that had been deliberately incorporated into the building materials. "Your mother didn't just live in this house," he said with growing understanding. "She chose this location because it was already significant. This hut is built on a site that our ancestors considered important. The implications were staggering. If the hut sat on historically significant ground, then everything about their situation took on new meaning. They weren't just outcasts living in a ruin. They were guardians of a sacred site, whether they had known it or not. But why didn't anyone else know?" Ahyoka asked. "Why didn't the tribal elders remember this place was important?" It was a painful question, one that touched on the deep wounds their people carried from generations of displacement and cultural disruption. Sometimes, little one, knowledge gets lost when people are forced to move quickly, when survival becomes more important than memory. The old ones who knew these things may have died before they could pass the knowledge on properly. Over the next several days, they conducted a careful excavation of their own home, working slowly and methodically to uncover whatever secrets the walls might hold. What they found exceeded their wildest expectations. Embedded throughout the structure were dozens of pottery fragments, carved stones, and other artifacts, all bearing symbols that corresponded to Ayana's documentation system. It was as if their ancestors had created a three-dimensional library, encoding important information directly into the building itself. "It's like a puzzle," Ahyoka said excitedly as they laid out the fragments they had collected. "Each piece tells part of a story," Nokose nodded, marveling at how his granddaughter's natural gift for pattern recognition was helping them understand something that had been hidden in plain sight for generations. "And the story they're telling is about water." Indeed, nearly every fragment they uncovered bore symbols related to water sources, flow patterns, and seasonal variations. Combined with Ayana's maps and notes, a clear picture was beginning to emerge of an ancient water management system that their ancestors had used to survive in the harsh desert environment. The spring wasn't just a source of drinking water. Nokose realized as he studied the assembled evidence. It was part of a larger system: underground streams, seasonal pools, natural reservoirs. Our ancestors understood the whole network, but their intensive excavation work hadn't gone unnoticed. Chief Nalnish arrived one morning, accompanied by several tribal council members, all wearing expressions of concern and curiosity. "Nokose," the chief said formally, "there are reports that you and the child have been digging around your home, disturbing the ground. The council is concerned about what you might be doing." Nokose felt his stomach tighten. They had been so careful to work quietly, to keep their activities hidden from casual observation. But in a small settlement, few secrets could be kept for long. "We are simply repairing our home," he said carefully. "Fixing the walls, replacing damaged materials." "That's not what it looks like to some people," said Kwahu, the elder who had participated in the earlier discussions about their living situation. "It looks like you're searching for something, or perhaps hiding something." Ahyoka pressed closer to her grandfather, her hand instinctively moving to touch the necklace beneath her clothing. They had taken to hiding it under her shirt after Bidziel's suspicious questions. But Nokose could see that several of the council members had noticed her nervous gesture. "Is there something you need to tell us?" Chief Nalnish asked, his tone not unkind but carrying the weight of authority. For a moment, Nokose considered telling them everything, about Ayana's hidden research, about the maps and artifacts, about the growing evidence that their humble hut sat on a site of great historical importance. But something held him back, some instinct that warned him the timing wasn't right. "There is nothing I need to tell you," he said finally, "beyond my gratitude for your patience with an old man and his granddaughter." Chief Nalnish studied his face for a long moment, clearly sensing that there was more to the story. But finally he nodded slowly. "Very well. But Nokose," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "the drought grows worse each week. Our water supplies are critically low, and people are frightened. If you know of anything at all, that might help our people survive what's coming, I hope you would share that knowledge." After the council members left, Nokose and Ahyoka sat in the shade of their home, both lost in thought. The pottery fragment lay between them, its ancient symbols seeming to pulse with significance in the afternoon light. "He knows we're hiding something," Ahyoka said quietly. "Yes, and soon we'll have to decide whether to trust him with what we've learned, or keep our secrets and watch our people suffer from thirst." The child looked up at him with those dark eyes that seemed far older than her 8 years. "What do you think Mother would want us to do?" It was the question that had been haunting Nokose since their first discovery. Why had Ayana hidden this knowledge instead of sharing it? What had she known or suspected that made secrecy seem like the safer choice? "I think," he said slowly, "your mother was protecting something precious until she could be sure it would be used wisely. Now that responsibility has passed to us." The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical burden, but also like a purpose he had been missing for too long. Whatever came next, he would not let his daughter's legacy or his granddaughter's future be determined by fear. The vision stone revealed itself on a morning when the drought had stretched into its 4th month, and the settlement's main water source had dwindled to a muddy trickle. Ahyoka found it, while helping her grandfather remove the last of the damaged wall chinking, her fingers closing around something that felt different from the pottery fragments and carved pieces. They had been uncovering something that seemed to pulse with warmth despite the cool morning. This feels alive," she whispered, holding up a smooth, polished stone about the size of a chicken egg. Its surface was dark obsidian, so perfectly polished that it seemed to contain depths that went on forever. Nokose set down his tools and approached carefully. He had heard stories of such stones, vision stones, his grandmother had called them, but he had never seen one himself. They were said to be used by the most powerful medicine people, tools for seeing beyond the ordinary world into the realm of spirits and deep knowledge. "Don't look directly into it," he warned, though he wasn't sure why the words came to him so urgently. But Ahyoka was already gazing into the stone's dark surface, her expression becoming dreamy and distant. "I can see water," she said in a voice that didn't sound quite like her own, "flowing in the dark, deep underground. And they're singing, the water is singing." Nokose felt the hair on his neck stand up. Ahyoka put the stone down. Instead, she held it closer, her eyes reflecting the obsidian's darkness. "The water knows the way home. It remembers the path our ancestors carved for it. But the path has been forgotten, and the water is lost. Child, I can see the place, grandfather. The sacred place where the water comes up from the deep earth. It's not far from here. It's been waiting for someone to remember, someone to come back and sing the old songs that call the water to the surface, with effort that seemed to cost her physically." Ahyoka tore her gaze away from the vision stone. She swayed for a moment, and Nokose caught her arm to steady her. "What did you see?" he asked gently. "Everything," she said, her voice still dreamy but becoming more like herself. "All of Mother's maps and tokens and writings, they all make sense now. The vision stone showed me how they fit together." Over the next hour, as Ahyoka's clarity returned completely, she guided her grandfather through a process that seemed part memory, part intuition, and part divine inspiration. Using the vision stone as a focus, she was able to decode the full meaning of Ayana's documentation system. "This symbol here," she said, pointing to a mark on one of the maps, "doesn't just mean sacred spring. It means the spring that answers when called. And these patterns around it, they're not just decoration. They're the songs, grandfather. The words and rhythms that our ancestors used to awaken the water." Nokose studied the intricate patterns she indicated, and gradually began to recognize elements he had heard in traditional Apache songs and ceremonies. His daughter had been even more brilliant than he had realized. She had found a way to preserve not just the location of the sacred spring, but the spiritual practices associated with it. And this, he pointed to another section of the map, the path to take, but also the proper time to take it. The spring doesn't always flow at the same strength. There are seasons and moon phases when the water is strongest, when the calling is most likely to be answered. As they worked through the maps and notes with their new understanding, a complete picture emerged of an ancient system of water management that went far beyond simple geography. Their ancestors had not just found water sources, they had developed a sophisticated relationship with the underground streams and springs, a spiritual technology that allowed them to work with natural cycles rather than against them. But their intense focus was broken by the sound of raised voices outside. Through the window, they could see a crowd gathering near the central fire pit. With Chief Nalnish standing on a raised platform addressing the assembly, water levels have dropped below critical, the chief was saying as they moved closer to hear. If the rains don't come within the next 2 weeks, we will be forced to relocate the entire settlement. A murmur of distress ran through the crowd. Relocation was always a last resort, involving the abandonment of homes, burial sites, and all the accumulated investments of community life. What about the old stories? Called out Tyanita, the elder who had recognized Ahyoka's necklace. Weren't there tales of a sacred spring somewhere in this area? Perhaps it's time to investigate whether those stories have any basis, in fact. Several people laughed dismissively, but Chief Nalnish raised his hand for silence. If anyone has knowledge of such a place, now would be the time to share it. Nokose felt every eye in the crowd turned toward him, as if some invisible force was drawing their attention. Beside him, Ahyoka touched the vision stone in her pocket, and he could feel her silent question as clearly as if she had spoken aloud. The sacred spring is not just a story, he found himself saying, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. It exists, and it can be found by those who know how to look. The reaction was immediate and intense. Some people began talking excitedly. Others shook their heads in disbelief, and still others looked at him with expressions ranging from hope to suspicion. And you know how to look? Chief Nalnish asked, his tone carefully neutral. My granddaughter and I have been studying the old ways, Nokose said, choosing his words carefully. We have found evidence that suggests the spring's location can be determined. Bidzil pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with anger. Evidence? What kind of evidence? Are we supposed to believe that crazy old man and his cursed child have somehow discovered something that generations of tribal elders have forgotten? Maybe we should listen before we judge, Tyanita said firmly. These are desperate times, and we cannot afford to dismiss any possibility. I agree, Chief Nalnish said. Nokose, if you truly believe you can find this spring, the tribal council is willing to hear what you have to say. Nokose felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. Once he revealed what they had discovered, there would be no going back. Their quiet life of hidden knowledge would be over, replaced by scrutiny, expectation, and possibly danger. But looking at the faces around him, seeing the fear and desperation that the drought had brought to his people, he knew there was only one choice to make. Give me 3 days to prepare, he said. Then I will show you what my daughter died trying to preserve. The crowd erupted in excited conversation, but Nokose barely heard it. Beside him, Ahyoka slipped her small hand into his, and he felt the vision stone's warmth through her pocket. Are you ready for this, little one? He asked quietly. She looked up at him with those ancient eyes and smiled. I've been ready since the day Mother taught me to read the patterns. This is what she was preparing me for. As they walked back to their hut, through the crowd of chattering neighbors, Nokose marveled at how quickly their world had changed. 3 days ago they had been outcasts. Now they were potentially the salvation of their entire people. The question was whether they were strong enough to bear that responsibility, and whether the secrets they guarded were truly meant to be shared. The betrayal revealed itself in the most ordinary way imaginable. A piece of paper left carelessly on a desk, glimpsed through an open window during what should have been a routine conversation about supplies. Nokose had come to speak with Chief Nalnish about the preparations for their expedition to find the sacred spring. But the chief was away from his lodge, and Nokose had waited outside. respectfully avoiding any appearance of intruding on private space. That was when the wind lifted the corner of a document on the chief's desk, revealing letterhead that made Nokose's blood turn to ice. Southwestern Development Corporation, in bold English letters across the top of what was clearly an official contract. Without thinking, he stepped closer to the window, his eyes scanning the visible portions of the document. What he read there shattered his understanding of everything that had been happening in their settlement over the past months. Final payment upon completion of tribal council agreement. And B, water rights transfer effective immediately upon relocation, and most damning of all, mineral survey indicates significant copper deposits beneath current settlement area. Nokose stepped back from the window as if he had been burned, his mind racing to process what he had just discovered. The tribal council, or at least Chief Nalnish, had been negotiating secretly with outside developers. The relocation that was being presented as a desperate response to drought was actually part of a planned land sale. Grandfather? Ahyoka's voice came from behind him, concerned and questioning. She had been waiting by the central fire pit while he spoke with the chief. "What's wrong?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." Before he could answer, Chief Nalnish appeared around the corner of his lodge, accompanied by two men that Nokose didn't recognize, Anglo men in city clothes who looked distinctly out of place in the settlement. "Nokose," the chief said, his tone carefully pleasant but with an underlying tension. "I was just concluding some business. Shall we discuss your preparations for the water expedition?" The two strangers glanced at Nokose with obvious curiosity, and he heard one of them mutter something about the local who claims to know about springs. Their dismissive tone sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the weather. "Perhaps another time," Nokose said carefully. "I see you have other matters to attend to." As they walked away, Ahyoka looked up at him with concern. "What happened? Why do you seem so upset?" Nokose waited until they were well away from the chief's lodge, before stopping beside a cluster of piñon trees that would hide them from casual observation. Then he knelt down to Ahyoka's eye level, his hands gentle but urgent on her shoulders. "Little one, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. I believe our people are in more danger than we realized, and it has nothing to do with the drought." Over the next few minutes, he explained what he had seen and what he suspected. Ahyoka listened with the focused attention she always brought to serious matters, asking questions that showed she understood the implications better than most adults would have. "So the chief wants to sell our land to these strangers?" she asked. "It appears that way. And if that's true, then finding the sacred spring isn't just about saving our people from thirst. It's about proving that this land is too valuable to sell." Ahyoka was quiet for a long moment, her small fingers absently turning the vision stone over in her pocket. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of understanding that seemed far beyond her years. "That's why Mother hid everything, isn't it? She knew that someone might try to sell our land, and she wanted to make sure the proof of its value would survive even if something happened to her." Nokose felt his throat tighten. "I believe so, yes. And that's why she died, isn't it?" Ahyoka's voice was barely a whisper. "Someone found out what she was doing and made sure she couldn't share it." The possibility had been growing in Nokose's mind ever since their first discoveries, but hearing his granddaughter voice it aloud made it feel terrifyingly real. Ayana's death had been attributed to a sudden illness, but what if it had been something more sinister? "We don't know that for certain," he said carefully. "But we need to be very, very careful about who we trust with what we've learned, even the chief. Especially the chief, at least until we understand what his involvement is in this land sale." They spent the rest of the day in careful observation, watching the comings and goings around Chief Nalnish's lodge with new eyes. What they saw confirmed their worst fears. The two Anglo men were clearly not casual visitors. They had set up what appeared to be a temporary office in one of the unused buildings, and several tribal council members were seen coming and going with documents and serious expressions. Most troubling of all, they observed Bidzil entering the building and emerging an hour later with what looked like a payment of some kind, an envelope that he tucked carefully inside his shirt before walking away with obvious satisfaction. He's working for them, Ahyoka said, with the flat certainty of a child who had learned not to be surprised by adult betrayal. That's why he's been so interested in what we're doing. He's been spying on us, Nokose nodded grimly. It all made terrible sense. Bidzil's hostile questions, his apparent knowledge of their activities, his insistence that they were hiding something valuable. He hadn't been acting out of simple malice or tribal politics. He'd been working for the Development Corporation, gathering information about potential obstacles to the land sale. If they know we've found evidence of the sacred spring, Nokose began, they'll try to stop us from sharing it, Ahyoka finished. Or they'll try to take it away from us and use it for themselves. The full scope of the danger they were in began to crystallize in Nokose's mind. They weren't just guardians of lost knowledge. They were the primary threat to a business deal worth potentially millions of dollars. And history was full of examples of what powerful people would do to remove such threats. We need to move quickly, he said, before they realize how much we know. Move quickly to do what? Nokose looked at his granddaughter, 8 years old, wise beyond her years, inheritor of knowledge that could save or doom their entire people, and felt the weight of impossible decisions settling on his shoulders. To prove that this land is too sacred and too valuable to sell, to show our people what the cost of relocation would really be, and to make sure your mother's sacrifice wasn't in vain. That evening, as they sat in their humble huts surrounded by the artifacts and knowledge that Ayana had died to preserve, Nokose made a decision that would change everything. They would no longer wait for the perfect moment or the safest circumstances. They would find the sacred spring, and they would do it before the land sale could be completed. Are you afraid, grandfather? Ahyoka asked as they prepared for bed. Nokose considered the question seriously. Yes, little one. I'm very afraid. But I'm also very determined, and sometimes determination is stronger than fear. Ahyoka smiled, reaching out to touch his weathered hand. Mother wasn't afraid either, was she? Even when she knew she was in danger. No, Nokose said softly. She wasn't afraid. She was brave, just like you. Outside their walls, the settlement slept peacefully, unaware that their future was being decided in secret negotiations and corporate boardrooms. But inside the crumbling hut that everyone dismissed as worthless, an old man and a young girl prepared to risk everything to save not just their people's land, but their people's soul. The sacred spring was calling to them across the years, its song preserved in maps and symbols, and the dying words of a woman who had loved her people enough to die for them. Tomorrow, they would begin the journey to answer that call, no matter what forces might try to stop them. The preparation began before dawn, in the sacred silence that exists between night and day, when the spirits are said to move most freely between worlds. Nokose had not slept, spending the dark hours in meditation and prayer, seeking guidance from ancestors whose wisdom had been interrupted by too many years of displacement and loss. In the dim light of their oil lamp, he carefully opened the small leather pouch that contained the traditional war paint pigments he had not used in decades. The colors: red ochre for courage, white clay for purification, yellow for the path of the sun, black charcoal for the depths of earth where water was born, felt both familiar and strange under his fingers. Will you teach me? Ahyoka asked softly, watching as he mixed the pigments with water according to formulas his grandmother had taught him when he was barely older than his granddaughter was now. These are not just decorations. Little one, he said as he worked, each color carries meaning. Each pattern tells a story. When a warrior paints his face, he is asking his ancestors to walk with him, to lend him their strength and wisdom. Am I a warrior too? Nokose paused in his mixing, looking at this small girl who had already shown more courage than many grown men. You are the bravest warrior I have ever known. But your weapons are not arrows and war clubs. They are knowledge and vision, and a heart that refuses to be broken by cruelty. He began with his own face. applying the colors in patterns that his grandfather had worn, that his great-grandfather had worn, reaching back through generations of men who had faced impossible odds with nothing but faith and determination. As he worked, he explained the meaning of each mark to Ahyoka. This line across the forehead represents the horizon, the meeting place between earth and sky, the boundary between the known and the unknown. These marks on the cheeks are for the 4 directions, asking for guidance from all the spirits who watch over travelers. And this symbol here, he touched a small spiral on his chin. This is for water, for the sacred springs that give life to all things. When it came time to paint Ahyoka's face, his hands trembled slightly. She was so young, and what they were about to attempt was so dangerous. But her dark eyes held steady courage, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone far older. "I'm ready, grandfather. Mother has been preparing me for this my whole life." He painted her face with gentle strokes, using patterns traditionally reserved for young women undertaking their first vision quest. The colors seemed to transform her, revealing the strength and wisdom that had always been present, but hidden beneath childhood's innocent mask. As the sun began to rise, they heard voices outside, the sound of people gathering, preparing for what many believed would be a fool's errand, led by a grief-stricken old man and his delusional granddaughter. Through their window, they could see Chief Nalnish addressing a small group of tribal members, his expression carefully neutral, but his body language suggesting tension. "There are those who doubt," came Tyanita's voice, raised in what sounded like an argument. "But these are desperate times, and we cannot afford to dismiss any possibility, no matter how unlikely it may seem. We cannot afford to waste resources on fantasy either," came Bidzil's sharp reply. "This expedition will accomplish nothing except to put people at risk for the delusions of a man who has never recovered from his daughter's death." Nokose felt anger rise in his chest, but Ahyoka placed a calming hand on his arm. "He's afraid," she said simply. "People who betray others are always afraid of being discovered." She was right, of course. Bidzil's vehement opposition to their expedition made perfect sense now that they understood his role in the land sale conspiracy. The last thing he wanted was for them to find proof that would make the tribal land too valuable to sell. "Are you certain you want to do this?" Chief Nalnish appeared in their doorway, his expression troubled. "The desert is unforgiving, especially for—" He stopped, taking in their painted faces and traditional preparations. "I see you are committed to this path." "We are," Nokose said simply. "As committed as our ancestors were when they first found the sacred waters." The chief studied him for a long moment, and Nokose wondered if he was seeing recognition in the man's eyes, recognition not just of their determination, but of the deeper knowledge they possessed. "How many will accompany you?" Nalnish asked finally. "However many choose to come," Nokose replied. "But we will go whether we travel alone or with 100 companions." Outside, the debate continued as tribal members wrestled with their decision. Some saw the expedition as a last hope in desperate times. Others viewed it as a dangerous waste of resources that the settlement could not afford. And a few, like Tyanita and several of the older women, seemed to sense that something more significant was happening, that this was not just a search for water, but a spiritual journey that could reconnect their people with ancestral wisdom. "I will come with you," Ciala announced, pushing through the gathered crowd. She was a practical woman, skilled in desert survival and known for her level-headed judgment. Her support would carry weight with others who were still undecided. "And I," said Kaya, a young mother whose children had been among the few to show kindness to Ahyoka. "If there is even a chance that this could secure water for our families, we must try." One by one, others stepped forward. Not many, perhaps 8 or 9 people total, but they were good people, strong people, individuals who understood that sometimes faith required action, even in the face of uncertainty. Bidzil watched the volunteers gather with undisguised frustration. "This is madness," he declared. You're following a broken old man and his cursed child into the desert to chase legends and fairy tales. Then stay behind, Tyanita said firmly. No one is forcing you to risk your precious safety for the welfare of others. The insult hit home, and Bidzil's face flushed with anger. When this expedition fails, when people die in the desert chasing fantasies, remember that I warned you. Remember that I tried to protect you from your own foolishness. With that, he stalked away, but not before Nokose caught the quick glance he threw toward Chief Nalnish's lodge, a look that spoke of consultation and coordination that had nothing to do with tribal welfare. He will try to sabotage us, Ahyoka whispered. Let him try, Nokose replied. Truth has a way of revealing itself, despite the efforts of those who would suppress it. The final preparations took most of the morning. Water containers were filled, dried food was packed, and walking supplies were distributed. Several people brought family heirlooms, turquoise jewelry, carved fetishes, medicine bundles, as offerings to the spirits they hoped to encounter. Nokose carefully packed Ayana's maps and documents in a waterproof pouch, along with the vision stone and the pottery fragments they had discovered. These were not just navigation tools, but sacred objects that would be needed to properly approach the spring when they found it. Grandfather, Ahyoka said as they made their final checks, what if we're wrong? What if we can't find it? Or what if it's dried up? Or what if the old ceremonies don't work anymore? It was a question he had been avoiding, but one that deserved an honest answer. Then we will have tried, little one. And sometimes the trying is more important than the succeeding, because it shows our ancestors that we still remember who we are. But even as he spoke the words, Nokose felt a certainty deep in his bones that they would succeed. The vision stone seemed to pulse with warmth in Ahyoka's pack, and the morning air carried scents that reminded him of his grandmother's stories about the sacred places where spirits and humans once walked together. As the expedition prepared to depart, Chief Nalnish approached them one final time. If you find what you're looking for, he said quietly, what will you do with that knowledge? The question carried layers of meaning, and Nokose understood that this was the chief's way of asking where his loyalties would lie when the sacred spring was found. With the tribe's ancient heritage, or with the modern pressures that land development represented, we will do what my daughter would have wanted, Nokose replied. We will ensure that our people's most sacred places are protected for future generations. Something shifted in the chief's expression, relief, perhaps, or maybe resignation. Then I pray the spirits guide your path and guard your safety. The expedition set out as the sun reached its full strength. 9 people following paths that existed more in memory and intuition than in any visible trail. Nokose led, with Ahyoka walking beside him, her small hand occasionally reaching out to touch the vision stone, as if drawing guidance from its ancient power. Behind them came their volunteers, Ciala with her practical supplies and desert knowledge, Tyanita carrying bundles of traditional ceremonial herbs, Kaya and the others who had chosen hope over skepticism. They moved in the respectful silence that desert travel demanded, conserving energy and water while staying alert for signs that would guide them toward their destination. But Nokose knew that their true journey had begun years earlier, when Ayana first started preserving the old knowledge. Everything since then, her death, their exile, the discovery of her hidden legacy, even the threat of the land sale, had been leading to this moment when the past would speak to the present, and the sacred would once again flow into the ordinary world. The desert stretched ahead of them, vast and seemingly empty, but full of secrets for those who knew how to read its signs. And somewhere in that wilderness, a spring of pure water waited for the songs that would call it back to life. The journey into the desert revealed its secrets slowly, like a story told in whispers that grew clearer with each mile traveled. For the first several hours, they followed game trails and natural rock formations that seemed random to untrained eyes but formed a pattern that Nokose was beginning to recognize from Ayana's careful documentation. Ahyoka proved to be an extraordinary guide. her connection to the vision stone, allowing her to sense directions and landmarks that weren't visible to the others. She would pause occasionally, holding the dark obsidian up to catch the light, then point confidently toward a distant ridge or rocky outcropping. That way, she would say with quiet certainty. And invariably, they would find confirmation of their path, a carved stone marker almost hidden by centuries of wind erosion, or a natural spring that appeared on Ayana's maps with notations about seasonal flow patterns. By midday, even the skeptical members of their group began to understand that this was not a random search. They were following a route that had been deliberately preserved, encoded in symbols and landmarks that their ancestors had used to navigate between sacred sites. "Look at this," Ciala called out, kneeling beside what appeared to be a natural rock formation. But closer examination revealed carved symbols almost identical to those they had found in the pottery fragments, markers that confirmed they were on the right path. The desert heat was brutal, but they managed it carefully, resting in whatever shade they could find and rationing their water according to Nokose's strict guidelines. None of them complained, understanding that this journey represented something far more important than personal comfort. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the landscape began to change subtly. The harsh, sun-baked ground gave way to areas where hardy plants grew in unexpected profusion, suggesting the presence of underground water sources. Ancient petroglyphs appeared on rock faces, some so faded by time that only Ahyoka's guided vision could make out their meanings. "We're close," she announced, as they paused to rest in the shade of a towering red rock formation. "The vision stone is getting warmer, and I can hear something like singing in the wind." Nokose listened carefully, and indeed, there was something different about the sound the breeze made as it moved through the rocks around them, a musical quality that seemed almost deliberate, as if the stones themselves had been shaped to create harmony. "There," Ahyoka pointed toward a narrow canyon that opened between two massive stone walls. "That's where we need to go." The canyon entrance was so narrow that they had to walk single file, the walls rising high on either side to create a corridor of stone that seemed to lead deeper into the heart of the earth. Ancient drawings covered every available surface, not the simple petroglyphs they had seen earlier, but complex murals that told elaborate stories of water ceremonies and spiritual connections between humans and the natural world. "Our ancestors made this place," Tyanita whispered in awe. "This whole canyon is a sacred site." As they moved deeper into the canyon, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the air took on a quality that reminded Nokose of the moments just before a thunderstorm. Heavy with possibility and electric with spiritual energy. The sound of their footsteps seemed to echo with unusual resonance, as if the walls themselves were amplifying every noise. Then Ahyoka stopped so suddenly that Nokose nearly collided with her. She was staring ahead with wide eyes, the vision stone clasped tightly in both hands. "Do you see it?" she whispered. At first, Nokose saw only more canyon wall, shadowed and unremarkable. But as his eyes adjusted to the light, he began to make out shapes that didn't belong to natural rock formation. There, carved directly into the living stone, was an archway decorated with symbols that matched every description in Ayana's notes. And beyond the archway, they could hear it, the unmistakable sound of flowing water. "The sacred spring," Ciala breathed, but it was Ahyoka who noticed the final confirmation. Beside the archway, set into a carefully carved niche, was a stone marker that perfectly matched the vision stone she carried. The two objects had clearly been created as a pair, one to mark the location and the other to guide seekers to this place. "This is it," Nokose said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is what your mother died protecting." Ahyoka approached the archway with reverent steps, her small fingers tracing the carved symbols with the familiarity of someone following a half-remembered dream. As she touched the final symbol, the spiral that represented the eternal flow of sacred water, they heard a change in the sound from beyond the arch. The water's voice grew stronger, clearer as if responding to her touch. And when they finally stepped through the archway into the chamber beyond, what they found there would forever change their understanding of what their ancestors had accomplished, and what they had left for future generations to discover. The chamber beyond the archway opened into a natural cathedral of stone, with walls that rose into shadows far above their heads, and a pool of water so clear it seemed like liquid crystal. But it was not just the beauty of the place that took their breath away. It was the sense of presence, as if the spirits of countless ancestors lingered here, waiting patiently for their descendants to return. The sacred spring bubbled up from depths that seemed to extend to the center of the earth, its water catching and reflecting light in ways that created moving patterns on the chamber walls. Nokose recognized some of the patterns from Ayana's maps, but others were new, as if the water itself was generating symbols and messages for those who knew how to interpret them. "It's singing," Ahyoka whispered, kneeling beside the pool. "The water is singing the old songs." Indeed, the sound the spring made as it bubbled and flowed was distinctly musical, with rhythms and tones that reminded Nokose of ceremonial chants he had learned as a child. It was as if the water retained memory of all the prayers and ceremonies that had been performed here over generations. Ciala was the first to fully comprehend the practical implications of their discovery. "Look how much water there is," she said in amazement. "This flow could supply our entire settlement, even in the worst drought." But Tyanita, her elder's wisdom recognizing deeper significance, shook her head gently. "This is not just about water for drinking and cooking. This is a sacred place. Our ancestors didn't just use this spring. They protected it, honored it, made it part of their spiritual practice." As if to confirm her words, Ahyoka stood and began moving around the chamber with purposeful steps, the vision stone guiding her to specific locations where she would pause and point. "Here is where they made offerings," she said, indicating a natural shelf in the rock where the remains of countless ceremonial items could still be seen. "And here is where they prepared for vision quests." She pointed to a section of wall covered with what appeared to be sleeping alcoves carved directly into the stone. And this, she moved to the far side of the chamber, where a series of clay vessels sat in carefully arranged rows. "This is where they collected the sacred water to take back to their people." Nokose approached the vessels with reverent care. They were ancient, some so old that they seemed to have been formed by the stone itself rather than human hands. But others showed clear signs of more recent use, and with a shock of recognition, he realized that several of them matched pottery styles his own grandmother had used. "People have been coming here more recently than we thought," he said. "Within living memory, maybe within the last generation." "Mother came here," Ahyoka said with quiet certainty. "I can feel it." She stood in this exact spot and filled vessels with sacred water. The truth of their discovery was overwhelming. Not only had they found the legendary sacred spring, but they had found evidence that it had never truly been lost, only hidden, protected by a small group of people who had maintained the secret across generations. "We need to fill the vessels," Nokose said, understanding finally why Ayana had preserved this knowledge so carefully. "We need to bring proof back to our people." Working together, they filled the ancient clay pots with spring water, each person handling the vessels with the reverence due to sacred objects. The water itself seemed to glow with inner light, and when they tasted it, as ceremony demanded, it was unlike any water they had ever experienced, with a sweetness and purity that seemed to nourish not just their bodies but their spirits. But their moment of wonder was interrupted by voices from outside the chamber, angry voices that did not belong to their expedition. In there, came Bidziel's voice, echoing off the canyon walls. "I told you they'd lead us right to it." Nokose felt his blood chill as he realized what had happened. They had been followed, and now the sacred spring that they had fought so hard to find was about to be discovered by those who would exploit it rather than protect it. "What do we do?" Ciala whispered urgently. "We protect what needs protecting," Nokose said firmly. And we make sure our people hear the truth before others can twist it to serve their own purposes. The voices were getting closer, and through the archway they could see lights, artificial lights, not the natural illumination that had guided their spiritual journey. "Ahyoka," Nokose said quietly, "take the vision stone and hide behind the altar. Whatever happens, make sure that stone survives to guide future generations. I'm not leaving you, grandfather." "You're not leaving me," he said gently. "You're continuing the work your mother started. You're making sure her sacrifice means something." As footsteps approached the sacred archway, Nokose and the others arranged themselves protectively around the filled water vessels, prepared to defend not just their discovery, but the right of their people to determine their own relationship with the sacred places their ancestors had left in their care. The confrontation that was about to unfold would determine not just the fate of the sacred spring, but the future of their entire people. The return journey to the settlement was triumphant in ways that none of them had dared to imagine when they first set out into the desert. Word of their discovery had spread like wildfire, carried by the members of their expedition, who could barely contain their excitement about what they had found. But the real transformation came when they arrived at the settlement, carrying the vessels of sacred spring water. What followed was not just confirmation of their discovery, but a series of events that seemed to flow as naturally as the water itself from their ancient source. The first miracle occurred when old Yaji, who had been bedridden for weeks with a wasting illness that the tribal doctors couldn't cure, insisted on drinking from one of the sacred vessels. Within hours, color had returned to his cheeks, and by the next morning, he was walking around the settlement with energy he hadn't shown in years. "It's not magic," Tyanita explained to the gathering crowd. "It's connection. When we drink water that has been blessed by proper ceremony, that comes from a place where our ancestors prayed and made offerings, it reminds our bodies and spirits of who we are meant to be. But the healing properties of the spring water, remarkable as they were, proved to be only the beginning of what their discovery would accomplish. When Chief Nalnish called an emergency council meeting to discuss the implications of finding the sacred spring, the gathering became something far more significant than a simple policy discussion. It became a moment of reckoning. "Before we discuss what to do about this spring," Nokose said when called upon to address the council, "there are some things the people have a right to know about what has been happening in our settlement." And there, in front of the entire assembled community, he revealed everything they had discovered about the secret land sale negotiations. He spoke calmly and factually, presenting the evidence they had gathered without accusation or anger, letting the truth speak for itself. The reaction was immediate and intense. Some council members tried to deny the allegations. Others attempted to justify their actions as necessary for the tribe's survival. But the evidence was too clear and the betrayal too obvious for any defense to hold. Chief Nalnish, to his credit, did not attempt to deny his involvement. Instead, he stood before his people with the dignity of a man accepting the consequences of his choices. "I believed," he said slowly, "that we had no other option. The drought, the declining resources, the pressure from outside forces. I thought selling part of our land was the only way to ensure our people's survival." "And now," asked Tyanita, the chief looked at the vessels of sacred water, at the faces of his people, at Ahyoka sitting beside her grandfather with the quiet confidence of someone who had helped save her entire community. "Now I understand that survival means more than just staying alive. It means preserving who we are, protecting the sacred places that connect us to our ancestors and our purpose." The formal vote to reject the land sale was unanimous. But more important than the political decision was the spiritual renewal that seemed to flow through the settlement like the sacred water itself. Over the following weeks, as people made pilgrimages to the spring and returned with vessels of the pure water, stories began to emerge that had been hidden for generations. Elderly tribal members shared memories of grandparents who had spoken in whispers about the old ceremonies. Traditional knowledge that had been fragmentary and half forgotten suddenly found context and meaning. The crumbling hut that had been the source of so much mockery was transformed as well. Working together, the entire community helped rebuild it into a proper home for Nokose and Ahyoka, but also into something more, a center for preserving and sharing the traditional knowledge that Ayana had died protecting. "Your daughter saved us all," Dianita told Nokose as they watched children playing games that incorporated the pattern recognition skills Ahyoka was teaching them. "Not just from thirst, but from forgetting who we are." Nokose nodded, watching his granddaughter demonstrate how to read water signs in the arrangement of stones, passing on knowledge that had nearly been lost forever. She knew this day would come. That's why she hid everything so carefully, why she made sure Ahyoka would be ready to carry on the work. The sacred spring became the cornerstone of a new charter that the tribal council drafted, a formal document that designated not just the spring itself, but the entire surrounding area as protected tribal land, sacred territory that could never be sold or developed. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was in the relationship between Nokose and his community. The man who had been dismissed as a broken dreamer was now recognized as a keeper of essential wisdom. The child who had been mocked for her strange games was now seen as a bridge between the ancient knowledge and the future. On the anniversary of Ayana's death, the entire settlement gathered at the rebuilt hut for a ceremony unlike any they had held in living memory. They sang the old songs that Ahyoka had learned from the spring itself. They shared stories about the importance of preserving traditional knowledge, and they made offerings of gratitude to the ancestors who had protected the sacred places through generations of hardship. As the ceremony concluded and people began to return to their homes, Ahyoka stood beside her grandfather, looking out at their community, no longer a collection of people struggling merely to survive, but a people reconnected to their purpose and their heritage. "Do you think Mother can see us?" she asked. Nokose smiled, feeling the weight of sorrow that had carried for so long transforming into something lighter and more hopeful. "I think your mother's spirit flows in everything we do to honor what she preserved for us. She lives in the spring water that heals our people, in the knowledge that guides our decisions, and most of all in the courage and wisdom she passed on to you." Above them, the stars emerged in the desert sky, the same stars that had guided their ancestors to water sources and sacred places for countless generations. The crumbling hut had become a home. The mocked outcasts had become honored guardians, and the sacred spring would flow pure and clear for generations yet unborn, protected by people who had rediscovered the true meaning of their heritage. The pattern was complete, as their ancestors had always known it would be.